Nice. Thank you for the thunderous applause. Well, it is really a joy to be back here in Enid. I am thrilled to be with you guys. I've been back here several times, and so it is a real joy for me to be here. My wife is here, Annette. She hasn't come before. I've been coming to Oklahoma now in the spring, and so she's now, our kids are up and out of the house, and so she's now coming with me, which is really nice, and so you'll get a chance to meet her and hear from her a little bit later. She'll tell you a little bit about her ministry and what's going on. But today, what we're doing, or this morning, what we're doing, is we're talking about the feasts of Israel. This is a time for us as followers of Jesus. We remember that today is Palm Sunday. This is the time that we remember that Jesus entered into the city of Jerusalem and is part of a series of events that we remember about this Holy Week. Nothing about this week happened in Jesus' life by accident. Nothing happened against his will. Nothing about this week was a plan B. There wasn't anything about Jesus' death that was a mistake. Jesus came, laid down his life willingly for you and me. He came for this week. It was a set day that he had planned from the beginning of time and the beginning of creation. And so, the holidays in the Bible that we read about and we celebrate, we see Jesus and the disciples celebrating, those two were holidays that were set in place. These are appointed times, as we will see, and out of them we see lessons about life, we see pictures of the Messiah, and I hope this morning as we go through these biblical feasts that they would be an encouragement, they would be helpful, they would be challenging, they would be even a little eye-opening for you. So, we're going to jump in now and talk about the gospel in the feasts of Israel. So before we jump in, I want to just talk briefly, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is from the Old Testament. And I love the Old Testament. I hope you love the Old Testament. But understanding how the Old Testament applies forward and how we can see Jesus and other principles that we see in Jesus' life in the Old Testament can be a little bit of a challenge. So, the next slide has two pictures, a puzzle and a stack of cookbooks. Often when we think about the Old Testament, many people think about it like a puzzle. If you can just put the pictures together, the pieces together right, it shows the right picture. Now, you might be puzzlers. Some of you are puzzlers. Many of us do puzzles on vacations. We often do puzzles on vacations. And when we do puzzles, when I do puzzles at least, there's part of it that's easy, right? We get the sides and the corners. That's how we start. There's a section there also that, if there's a lot of activity, we can see. But then you come across a section with, like, sky or grass. I turn into a raving lunatic during this time when I'm putting in puzzles, because I can't figure out how it works. So what do I start doing? Blaming everybody else. It's the manufacturer, right? Somehow they didn't print all the pieces correctly. Something was left out of the box, right? So then I go through that. Then next, my children. I'm blaming them. Who stole one of the pieces off the table? And they said, Dad, no one stole the piece. Well, I know someone stole. So I'm grumbling around, walking around, and then I'll take a piece and I look at it for an hour sometimes, thinking, where does this fit? If that's how we think about the Old Testament and understanding it, no wonder it gets frustrating, right? No wonder we start our yearly Bible readings, and Genesis is cool, and Exodus is great. We saw the movie, both of them, so we're on track. And then we get into Leviticus, and you think there's boils and hair in boils, and there's clean and unclean, and how does this work? And you think, how is this possibly going to going to go? Well, I want to offer you another way of thinking about the Old Testament through the metaphor of a cookbook rather than a puzzle. So a cookbook, if you can imagine, let's say cookbooks always have, there might be a cookbook about a certain kind of food, Italian food or something, or a cookbook about a certain kind of place. Oklahoma has a cookbook, or a cookbook with a certain ingredient, let's say. So let's say you have a cookbook that's about salt, okay? Everything in the cookbook, every recipe has salt in it. Some recipes are very salty, and so we can taste the salt, right up front with the dish. Other dishes have salt in them, but you wouldn't even notice. You don't even taste the salt. What the salt does in those dishes is the salt enhances the other flavors that are in the dish. You would notice if the salt isn't there, but you don't really notice that the salt is there. I think the Old Testament, especially when we think about the Messiah, functions a lot like the cookbook. There's certain passages, there's certain sections, they're very salty. Like that's right up front. This is clearly about the Messiah. There's other passages where we think, okay, I'm not sure how that relates. But what I want you to know is in the Old Testament, the Messiah is there in every verse. He's there in every place, every corner of that book. Some areas it's easier to see. Some areas it just flavors the other story. But he's there at every point. So, as you think about reading, as we are going to be looking at the Old Testament this morning, I want you to have this idea in mind that perhaps some areas are more subtle than others, but God's promises are always there. God's promises are yes and amen. They are true. We can count on them, and it's a joy to be able to share these things with you. So, the book of Leviticus is where we see the story of the 7 biblical feasts. And I know what you're thinking. Not another sermon from the book of Leviticus. I mean, wow, it's every week, Leviticus, Leviticus, Leviticus. Well, I know Leviticus can be a little intimidating, but this is where we find the picture of the 7 biblical feasts. And here's what we read. We read, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord. The appointed feasts of the Lord. These feasts, as we will read through parts of this chapter, God says are set in time. These are times that I want to meet with you and have special thing to do. So the next slide tells us a little bit about this word appointed feast. It's moed in Hebrew. Say that with me. Moed. Okay. These are all moeds. Now, it's an interesting word. Sometimes it's used of holidays. Sometimes it's used of other things. In Genesis 18, before Isaac was born, God said to his mother, you are going to have a baby. It was a moed. It was an appointed time. In the book of Exodus, when Moses spoke to Pharaoh and said, let my people go, it's time to let my people go. And throughout the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, we read a lot, especially in Exodus, about the tent of meeting. And that tent of meeting is, again, the tent of moed. So a moed is a time or place that God has set aside for a special meeting with his people. That's part of what we celebrate when we come together on Sunday morning for church, isn't it? That's part of what we celebrate when we take communion together. This is a special time when we are able to meet with God in a unique way in a community. All of these holidays function that way in one way or another. And I want to say that all of these holidays also point to the person of the Messiah. So we're going to go through a couple of slides, and I'm just going to show you the names of these holidays and show you when they appear. So the first of the holidays, interestingly, is the weekly Sabbath. So all the holidays in some ways are rests. They're all Sabbaths. And so we have this weekly event to remind us of what God does. So in Hebrew, the days of the week are not named like they are, like, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, but they are first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth Sabbath. The days of the week in the Hebrew calendar remind us of creation. The Sabbath, the seventh day, is the day that God rests. So God says, I want you to rest also. So all of these days are reminders. And what you will see is the holidays are all reminders again. So in the spring, we have 3 holidays: Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Festival of First Fruits. In the summer, we have a holiday that's called Pentecost. We can go to the next slide. There we go. The holiday of Pentecost, it's about harvest, it's about abundance, fruitfulness. And in the fall, we have 3 holidays: the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, I grew up in a Jewish home. My wife and I are both Jewish. I've been a follower of Jesus now for about 35 years. But these holidays, as I grew up celebrating them, and as many Jewish people go about celebrating them, are not just cultural holidays, or they're not just religious holidays, they're also cultural holidays. And in many families, actually, the idea that you're connecting with God is a foreign concept. I grew up in a pretty secular Jewish home. So in many Jewish people don't necessarily have this connection with God through these holidays, but they're more cultural events. Yet God has said in each of these holidays that he wants to meet with us. And that's really the main point that we can get across. So though Jewish people, many, at least in the United States and around the world, are more secular and see these through more cultural lenses, God has something in store for all of his people. So we're going to talk about now the holidays a little bit more, and I'm going to remind you of some of the things and as we start in the Passover. So 2 years ago, I came and led us through a demonstration of a Passover Seder. Passover is the holiday that reminds us of the Exodus from Egypt. We tell the story. We gather together with our family in a meal where we celebrate something called the Passover Seder. Jesus would have done this with his disciples before his death. In fact, the night before he was crucified, he celebrated Passover with his disciples. It's an amazing holiday that reminds us of the blood of the lambs. And the great story of Passover is that God gave a provision to the people of Israel that on the 10th plague, the angel of death, that God told the Jewish people to take blood of a lamb, to paint it on the doors of their homes, and when the angel of death sees the blood on the door, death will pass over that home. We see that Jesus on Passover used the holiday to identify himself with the lambs in Egypt that were sacrificed in order that the Jewish people would be set free. Passover is the day then that Jesus died. Remember, in Jewish tradition, the day starts and ends at sundown, not midnight. So sundown, that evening, Jesus and his disciples celebrate Passover. That night, he's arrested. The next day, before sundown, he is crucified and killed. All right. It's happening. All right. So, there's thunder, there's lightning, right? All of this. Yeah. Okay. The next holiday is the Festival of First Fruits, and that's when he rises from the dead. All of this is so unexpected, these sounds that we get sometimes, but these holidays remind us that God is active and alive. So on Passover, Jesus dies. The next holiday, which is the beginning of the early harvest, the Festival of First Fruits, the first crops that are harvested in and given to God, that's the day that Jesus rises from the dead, being the first fruits of all creation, showing us that he is with us, that he has not forgotten us, he has not abandoned us. We are not alone. We can turn to him. He is present. The holiday of Passover and these spring holidays tell a remarkable story of the Messiah's death and his resurrection. The next holiday that we come to is called the Feast of Pentecost. And this happens 50 days. That's why we call it Pentecost, Penta 50. 50 days after the first Sunday in the week of Passover is the next holiday. And it's in Hebrew, it's called the Festival of Weeks, or Shavuot. And during this time was a period of harvest, the early harvest. Now, it's not quite like harvests that happen here. This is all harvest done by hand. So they're harvesting about a bushel load of grain per day. And they do that for 50 days, and that's the first harvest. At the end of that period of time, there's a celebration of abundance, of thanksgiving. And God says, I want you to take the fruit of your land, all of your harvest. I want you to make loaves of bread, and I want you to rejoice before the Lord and bring that together and join together as a family and community and celebrate. But it's important to keep in mind that when God told the Jewish people to celebrate this holiday, they had no crops. They had no land. They were in the desert. They were wandering. They had manna. Manna in Hebrew literally means, what is it? They didn't even know what this stuff was. It was food. But they didn't have crops. So this whole holiday, the holiday of Pentecost, is a holiday of promise. That God would give you something in the future more than what you have. And we know that in the book of Acts, we know that Jesus, during this period of time, appeared over 40 days to his disciples, and then it was on the holiday of Pentecost that the Holy Spirit was poured out as a helper, as a reminder that God has indwelled us, and that we are not alone as followers of him, making good on the promise that Jesus gave to his disciples. So the summer holidays, we see a picture of God's empowerment and God's presence. And then in the fall, these three holidays begin with a trumpet blast. This is a young boy blowing what's called a shofar. It's a ram's horn, and it's blown during this time, this holiday. It's called the Feast of Trumpets. Sometimes it's called Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. But the holiday of trumpets is supposed to be something that gains our attention. The holiday of trumpets signals the start of something. On the Sabbath, we celebrate the seventh day. These holidays, there are 7 of them. And the trumpets, the Festival of Trumpets, is the first day of the 7th month. None of that is by accident. It's all on purpose, and God is doing something special in these 3 holidays. So the trumpet blast is to gain our attention so that we recognize and prepare for the next holiday, which is called the Day of Atonement. And the Day of Atonement is the holiday that God offers, that God says that the priest should offer a sacrifice for sin once a year that would cover the sins of the people, and the people of Israel will be set free. So the last time I was here, and sharing a Passover at the end of my meeting, Alan Seibel, if you remember, came out wearing a yarmulke. And if anyone thought that Alan did that out of some false motive or anything, Alan, based on the Day of Atonement that we're talking about, you are forgiven, my friend. So, but the holiday of the Day of Atonement is one, it's probably the most sober of the holidays, but there's actually two sacrifices. One is a sacrifice on the altar, an animal sacrifice, where an animal would be killed, its blood put on the altar, and that blood would atone for, pay for the sins of the nation over the last year. The second of the two sacrifices was called a scapegoat offering, where it was more of a symbolic one, where the high priest would put his hands over the altar, or over the lamb or the animal, and say, "Upon you, animal, I put all the sins of the nation," and that animal would be then led out of the camp and into the wilderness and let go. And that idea is that God will not just pay for the sins of the people, but God will also remove from you the shame and the pain of living with sin. And so these two sacrifices are what the Day of Atonement is based on. Today, the self-denial is interpreted as fasting. However, in the Bible, these two offerings presented a final cleansing of sin for all people at all times. And finally, this leads us to the last holiday, the Feast of Tabernacles, where God says, go with your family, go to Jerusalem for a week, build a shelter, live in it, and rejoice before the Lord for 7 days. This holiday is basically God saying, I want you to go camping for a week in Jerusalem and live out there and enjoy with your family. Often you take fruit of the land, you take palm branches, you put them on the outside of your tabernacle, your sukkah that you build, and you live in it. Jesus himself celebrated this holiday in John chapter 7. It says, on the last and most important day of the festival, Jesus stood up and cried out, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. The one who believes in me, as the scripture said, will have streams of living water flowing from deep within them. When it says the last and most important day of the feast, that was the Feast of Tabernacles that Jesus was celebrating. So Jesus is celebrating all of these feasts and using them as a foundation for how we are to both live in relationship with God and follow him in the promises that he has given. The next holiday, or the next slide, shows us at the end of at the end of this chapter in Leviticus, it says you're to live in shelters for 7 days. All the native-born and Israelites shall live in shelters so that your generations may know. Part of these holidays is based on the extended family together that can celebrate, that live in this shelter, that experience these holidays together, that are invited into the relationship with God that he provides through these holidays. All 7 of these feasts speak about God's provision but they invite us to remember the past so that we can rejoice in the present and trust God for the future. If we forget what God has done in our own lives, we are bound to make the same mistakes over and over again. We lose the strength of the lessons that we learn. And if we forget the past, not just our own past, but if we forget the past of who we are as followers of Messiah, as in the world of believers, we also lose the lessons that God has given us as the ones that have been set apart for his purposes. So remembering is an essential element of what it is to be a follower of Jesus, because as we remember, we rejoice. Today is another Jewish holiday. Today is not one of the 7 biblical holidays, but today is a holiday that's called Purim. And Purim is a holiday based on the book of Esther. And what Esther reminds us of is that God will keep his promises. God will keep his promises to Israel. God will keep his promises to you. And God will keep his promises to me. It might be that might happen through an unlikely person. It might be a young person. It might be an old person. It might be a group. But God will keep his promises no matter what. Nothing will keep his plan from happening. So I'm going to show you this is a picture of our branch in Los Angeles where we work and function. This is some of our staff celebrating a holiday event with several of the other people. In that photo, there's a number of Jewish people who are believers and a number who are not believers. This is part of the community that we have in Los Angeles where we serve. Annette and I are both part of Jews for Jesus, serving as missionaries. And we want to take a few minutes and just tell you a little bit about the work of Jews for Jesus. Now, Los Angeles, I know, gets a bad rap sometimes. Why are we there? The LA area has about 750,000 Jewish people. It's the 3rd largest urban Jewish population in the world. The first is New York with about 2 million Jewish people. The second is Tel Aviv with a little less than that, maybe 1.5 million, and Los Angeles with about 700,000 Jewish people. So we're there ministering, reaching out, connecting, trying to engage with Jewish people in our midst. And Annette is serving on our staff, and I'm going to invite her up, and so she's going to tell a little bit about some of the work that she's been doing with a group of women in the area.
Good morning. Yes, so I'm a missionary to Jewish women in Los Angeles, and my goal is to be able to meet individually with Jewish women who've expressed an interest in knowing more about who Jesus is, and studying the scriptures with them, and hopefully bringing them to faith in Messiah Jesus. I've got a handful of women now who have come to faith in Jesus and who need to be discipled, who need to learn. For the most part, the people that we work with have never read the Bible for themselves in English. Maybe they had a time when they learned something in Hebrew or some prayers, but they've never read the Bible in English for themselves and learned about the Lord. And so I started a Zoom online Bible study for these Jewish women. And we studied through a book called Dig Deeper, Tools for Understanding God's Word, How to Read the Bible. And now, a few weeks ago, we started studying the book of Mark. So I got the contact information about a month ago, or a little more than a month ago, for a woman named Iris. And Iris is an Israeli woman who is living in Texas with her Christian husband. And she and he met in Israel. Iris was in the Air Force in Israel, and her husband came there to study, and they met and married. Now she lives in the States. But her husband's been sharing about Jesus with her, and she went to our Hebrew language website and has been watching videos of testimonies of Israelis who've come to faith in Jesus. And she was really affected by those, and so she gave us her name, contact information to receive a copy of the Hebrew New Testament. And so that came to her in the mail. Her name came to me. I gave her a call. We had like a 2-hour, initial visit with each other on Zoom, and then I invited her to that Bible study. And so over the last month, she's come 3 times to that. And the thing that she struggles with the most in following Jesus is the idea of Jesus' deity. Because for the Jewish people, they believe in one God, and the idea that we should follow some man who says he is God is a very hard one to kind of accept, this idea. And so that's something that she's going to be learning about as we go through the book of Mark, and she'll begin to understand why we believe that Jesus is God. So.
Great. Thanks, Annette. Much of our work in these last couple of months, as you might imagine, is connected to Israel. The next slide is a picture of the skyline of Tel Aviv, and in Hebrew, that reads, "Pray for Tel Aviv." And Iris responded to a request for a New Testament, and that request actually came from our Israel branch. So we're going to take a minute now and watch a short video and let some of the voices of our Israel team speak, and they're going to tell you some of this outreach effort that they've been doing in Israel since the war has begun in October of last year. So let's go ahead and watch that video now.
The war affected our team. Some of our staff live in cities that are bombed severely, so some of them even lost friends.
We all know, either firsthand or secondhand, people who have lost loved ones in those terror attacks. There's been a rise in anti-Semitism, and we're a part of the Jewish community, so we have felt the hatred.
I think that people of Israel feel hopeless and fearful about the future, and they don't know what's ahead.
So many in Israel are not only living in fear, but living without the hope of redemption in Messiah.
Very few people believe in Jesus, maybe less than 1%. Most of the Israelis do not have access to New Testament in their native language.
More than 100,000 residents of Israel were evacuated from their homes. They needed care.
The Lord calls me to visit and to comfort and bring food.
There were weeks that we've sent 5,000 packages of food to families throughout Israel.
We have been producing animated verses from the book of Psalms just to uplift Israelis.
God is opening up people's hearts to the gospel right now in ways we have never seen before.
We've received over 600 requests for the New Testament in only 3 months.
We have an opportunity to come alongside them and stand with them and love and support them in ways that are only possible when people hit rock bottom.
Jesus' message is one of love, hope, and healing. It is relevant for Israelis now more than ever.
Just encourage your Jewish neighbors, encourage your Jewish friends with prayer, with visits.
Would you pray for the peace of Jerusalem? Would you pray for the salvation of the Jewish people? Together we can love and serve the people of Israel.
Amen. So Iris was one of those people that responded for requesting a New Testament in Hebrew. These holidays, the outreach that we do, this season of our year, remind us that God is ever present. He keeps his promises. He can be trusted. He can be turned to. And he invites you and he invites me in this season to receive the blessing that he wants to pour out in our lives. May that be all of our experience as we go into this week ahead.